I'm Jitej Kaur Garewal, Assistant Professor, Department of Art History and Visual Arts, Punjab University, Chandigarh. Today we're going to discuss company painting. With the coming of the British and the political ascendancy, the socio-economic and cultural climate of the subcontinent also changed. Coming to a land that was unknown till then evoked a great degree of interest and enthused the wish to capture its various aspects. One result of this was the work of Indian painters for British patrons, leading to an adjustment the former made to meet the requirements of the latter. This module examines the Indian painting tradition that emerged out of this adjustment, referred to as company painting, in detail. Looking at the transformation in the art practices of the Indian painter in different regions of the country, the module also traces the similarity, differences, and evolution in the painting style in the major centers it was practiced in. The impact of European art in India initially came via the Portuguese missionaries in the form of illustrated Bibles at the court of Akbar. It did exert an interest among both patrons and painters, and even as scholars trace its influence in Mughal painting in the degree of naturalism, it largely remained dormant. The waning of the Mughal Empire and the ascendancy of the British East India Company from around the mid 18th century onwards had far reaching impact not just on the political landscape but also on socio cultural life. The visual arts too were impacted, and what emerged from it was company painting. The company school or company painting dates mainly to the 18th and 19th centuries. The tide turned for the British with the battles of Plassey, 1757, and Buxar, 1764, following which the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II became a pensioner and the British got Diwani rights. This secured the political ascendancy of the company in India. By this time, the British settlements had begun growing in Bengal and on the Coromandel coast, and the presidencies of Fort St. George and Fort William were increasingly aggressive. The British in India at that time could be distinguished as officials, non-officials, and missionaries. Till the beginning of the 19th century, there had been social interaction between the British and the Indians, as the former were few in number and socially dependent on the Indians. Also, the British had not as yet come to view themselves as the ruling race. In England, the Charter Act of 1813 removed the restrictions to the immigration of Christian missionaries who did engender a schism with the Indians. The opening of the Suez Canal brought more English men and women, thus increasing their population, increasingly making them a closed social group and reducing their social interaction with Indians. Where once there had been Englishmen who adopted Indian dress and habits and married Indian women, now towns had British areas, and the earlier type of interaction with the Indians was frowned upon. The British in India at that time could be distinguished as officials, non-officials, and missionaries. Now we look at the cult of the picturesque and its manifestation of Indian soil. Mildred W.G. Archer relates the emergence of company painting in India to certain contributing factors that ranged from the political situation in the country to the socio-cultural and intellectual aspects of British life in India and the home country. 1. In 18th century England, intellectual pursuits were respected and there was esteem of knowledge. So when the British found themselves in the East, in a country not known to them, they sought to learn about it, its people and culture. As a result, a number of British contributed immensely to knowledge about India, such as Sir William Jones, who translated Indian texts and founded the Asiatic Society in Kolkata, or Sir Charles Wilkins, who did the first translation of the Bhagavad Gita into English, or James Forbes, who studied the manners and costumes of Indians, to name just a few. Second, in England towards the end of the 18th century, a new approach to life and nature had emerged that gave rise to the cult of the picturesque and a new enthusiasm for the manners, trades, and occupations of the peasantry and workers and the products of the Industrial Revolution. A taste developed for picturesque prints and pictures, and India excited this interest for the new, exotic, and picturesque, and consequently to capturing it. Many responded to the stimuli, and there are numerous works published by the British in India on its customs, people, and costumes, festivals, etc. Some being Captain Grindlay's Scenery, Costumes, and Architecture, William Taylor's sketches illustrating the manners and customs of the Indians and Anglo-Indians, and Fanny Park's The Wanderings of a Pilgrim in Search of the Picturesque, which has vivid depictions of hosts of festivals, costumes, landscapes, and architecture of India. There are many other names that come to the forefront in this regard. Emily Eden, who in her works recorded characters both rich and poor, James Prinsep, who noted antiquities of Benares, James Fraser, who illustrated romantic landscapes of Calcutta, and Himalayas, Richard Barron's views of Nilgiris, and William Bailey's views of Calcutta and Charles Doyley's sketches of Patna. Apart from the above mentioned amateur artists, whose artistic merit differed widely, the second half of the 18th century saw the beginning of the arrival of professional artists from Britain and Europe in India. The professionals can be categorized as oil painters, miniature portraitists on ivory, and watercolorists. The first included artists such as Tilly Kettle, Johann Zoffany, and Arthur Davis. They worked mainly for the Nawabs and the princes, painting portraits and history paintings in oils. The miniaturists in ivory were John Smart, Ozias Humphrey, and George Kinnery. The third category being the watercolorists, who produce drawings either as ends in themselves or as studies for subsequent engravings, aquatints or lithographs, and even oil paintings on their return home. The notable artists under this category are William Hodges, James Wales, James Moffat, Thomas and William Daniel. Some of the Daniels' drawings were made into engravings and included in their famous views of Calcutta, Oriental scenery, and a picturesque voyage to India. The work of these artists was realistic, employed chiaroscuro and perspective, and especially in the work of the watercolorists, dull sepia tones and grays were predominant. The work of these artists can be categorized as a watered-down neoclassicism that had also molded British taste back home and continued to do so in India. Mildred and W.G. Archer, commenting on the style of these works, termed it as being that of suggestive realism, blending the picturesque classicism of Claude, Poussin, and Salvatore with the naturalism of Ruysdael. Now we come to the status of the Indian painter, which is the study of this module. Meanwhile, the patronage of Indian artists by the princely courts had been on a downward trajectory. With the decline of the Mughal Empire and their vastly reduced capacity for the patronage of the arts, the Indian miniaturist initially moved to the provincial courts. Thus, in the 18th century, even as some stayed back in Delhi, many moved to Lucknow, Faizabad, Murshidabad, and painting flourished here. But with the rise of the British and their expansionist agenda, these courts too began to decline. Meanwhile, British settlements grew and flourished in areas that had a strong local tradition of art, such as Murshidabad, Tanjore, Calcutta, and also those that didn't, such as Madras and Bombay. With their established patterns of patronage at an end, the Indian artist turned to the new emerging ruling class for work. As the Archers state, this had a certain despairing urgency. These artists commenced exploring foreign needs. This entailed a willingness to adapt to the taste of the new patrons and adjust technique and vision accordingly. These circumstances gave rise to a new style and the techniques this was executed in. It is this adaptability that provided the foundation for art under the new patrons to flourish on Indian soil. The Indian painter was a descendant of artists who had worked at the Mughal court and other provincial courts and thus came from a long, rich tradition of miniature painting. He was a master of line, adept at the harmonious use of rich color palette and the delicate blending of colors, skilled at creating a rounded two-dimensionality and in conveying a sense of space without illusionism. He was used to working on a small scale, making works that were held in the hand and read. And most importantly, his approach was essentially idealistic, bent to evoke a lyrical ambience. The aesthetic tradition his new patrons sought to impose modeled form with chiaroscuro, employed perspective to create illusionistic space, aimed for realism and dramatic impact in painting. Indian artists, already adept in the art of line, now incorporated the use of light and shade, perspective, use of the watercolor medium, modification of colors from an earlier brilliant palette to a more subdued one with the increasing use of sepia, muted greens, etc. The colors also began to be applied in soft washes on unprepared ground, and machine made paper began to be increasingly used. And the subject matter shifted in response to British taste to common subjects: trade, crafts, costumes, festivals, servant sets known as firkas, architectural drawings, etc. This adjustment in style came about largely through imbibing the new style informally, such as through the copying of British originals, such as the work of the professional painters in India, through the study of prints and watercolors, and also by working as assistants to British amateur and professional artists. For example, the Patna artist Jairam Das assisted Sir Charles Doyley in his lithographic press. The artist Shiv Lal worked for William Tyler and D.R. Lyle. The British, who with their well-formed ideas of what constituted good art, had not been enthusiastic about the traditional Indian art practices, engaged with the local artists initially for menial work, such as house decoration, and others worked as draftsmen under British engineers, employing their skill for detailed and delicate work, for map making and survey work. Another work that was suited to their skills was natural history drawings. That too required fine line work and detail. Both these types of works did not require special training. The recording of flora and fauna of the subcontinent had become a project for the British, and many Englishmen played an important role in it. One example is Sir Alaya in Lady Impey, who began collecting and extensively patronizing natural history works documenting birds, mammals, and plants around 1774. Works done for them are signed and dated by Indian artists such as Sheikh Zainuddin, Ramdas, and Bhavani Das. All being natives of Patna, apparently working in Calcutta. The efforts of the individuals were further augmented by the company that established large botanical gardens to study flora and fauna for its commercial and medicinal purpose. Dr. William Roxburgh from 1793 to 1813 hired some Indian painters including Gurudayal, Haludar, Vishnu Prasad and Mahangu Lal, all from Murshidabad or Patna or farther north. The team produced about 2,500 paintings, now bound in 35 volumes. To this band of local artists were later added Gorachand and Runigar by Nathaniel Wallach, who was apparently the successor of Dr. Wallach. This initial engagement with the Indian artist fostered a growing confidence in his ability, further opening the portals of British patronage for the Indian painter. The British patronage of Indian artists was aided also by the fact that not only were the professional British and European artists expensive to afford, but British amateur artists had their limitations, and most importantly, the Indian painter was most advantageously placed to draw and paint his country and countrymen. Pran Neville is of the view that even though the Indian artist adapted to new Western ways of painting, he preserved some traditional Indian elements in his works, that even as they gave up their use of gouache, brilliant hue and shading of solid form, they were able to preserve to an extent the old finesse. This special kind of painting is what came to be known as company painting. The first region to produce company painting was the Madras Presidency, Tanjore being the principal center, followed by Tiruchirappalli and Madras. As soon as this style was adopted by the native artists, they received patronage in the northern and eastern parts of India, including Calcutta, Murshidabad, Patna, Banaras and Lucknow. By the early 19th century, company painting had spread to Agra, Delhi and Punjab. In fact, the spread of the style followed the spread of British rule in the country. What is interesting is that even as the style began to be practiced in different parts of the country, artists in the different towns also brought their own interpretation or response to the practice of this idiom. Also, during this period, though still few in number, the names of artists also begin to emerge. Places such as Murshidabad, Lucknow, Tanjore and Delhi, due to being important provincial courts and seats of rulers, already had a tradition of painting that was in decline, and the artists adapted to the new style, whereas places such as Patna, Banaras, Madras and Western India that did not boast of a tradition of painting now emerged as centers of this Indian British painting. Now we'll briefly look at some centers of company painting. In Murshidabad, with the collapse of the provincial court, the British emerged as the patrons who were sought by the artists. As Archer says, the local artists began in about 1770 to canvass the British bungalows at the British cantonment of Behrampur, 6 miles south of Murshidabad. Employing the techniques of watercolor on paper and mica, the artists painted miniature portraits of the British, portrait sets of the erstwhile rulers, and the most popular depictions of festivals and ceremonies such as Diwali and Muharram, wedding ceremonies and sati. Apart from this, the standard sets of servants, costumes, castes, and trades, etc., were also made. Such work continued here till about 1850, following the move of the British to other towns till the British cantonment was closed in 1870. As Murshidabad lost, Patna gained, as it emerged as a centre of British presence. The city also saw the Kayast artists, who had moved to Murshidabad in about 1730 from Delhi, now shift to Patna in around 1760. Amongst these, an artist by the name of Sevak Ram became well established, and works produced under him can be divided into two groups. The first portrays Indian occupations that appealed to British patrons and were known as firqa or occupation sets. A departure from the previous courtly traditional themes, the subject matter included holy men, dancing girls, peasants, hawkers, and many such professions answering to the concept of the picturesque. The second group of works under the same artist consists of pictures painted in a comparably larger format, depicting festivals and rituals. The style of both the sets shows the use of perspective, watercolors, as well as indigenous body color to paint figures in somber sepias. Clothes are usually dull white with soft grey shadows enlivened by touches of deep crimson, dull gold, and peacock blue. A palpable characteristic face type emerges with a pointed nose, heavy eyebrows, deep-set staring eyes, and fatigued expressions. There was another prominent artist in Patna by the name of Hulas Lal, whose ancestors had worked in Benares, and he later shifted to Patna. Mildred and W.G. Archer observed that even though his working style and themes were close to that of Sevak Ram, he is an important case study due to certain sketchbooks which depict transformation in the art practices of the local artist. The adjustment of technique is evident in his notes from life, to be worked upon later in the studio, exercises in perspective, and pen and ink copies of British artworks. Patna, as one of the centres of company administration, had a number of Indian artists working in this hybrid style, such as Lalji, Jairam Das, Jhumka Lal, Fakir Chand Lal, Tuni Lal, Shiv Lal, and others who had a good market and were either working independently or as workshop assistants. Another amateur artist in Patna, Sir Charles Doyley, had set up the press, the Bihar Lithography, in which an Indian artist, Jairam Das, was employed to transfer sketches to the stone. This is an example of an Indian artist learning by assisting a British amateur. Even as Das's work shows the influence of Doyley, he went on to make Men and Animals in Hindustan in 1834 with 36 drawings in watercolor and pencil and a number of miniature portraits in ivory around the same time. Doyley's commissioning of Indian artists, as discussed, would have played a pivotal role in the dissemination of British taste and style amongst the local artist community. Apart from learning through association, the readily available lithographed prints and engravings were also collected by local artists who absorbed the style, some of them even freely copying the works. The prolific work being done at Patna is also revealed by the fact that a number of artists, such as Fakir Chand Lal and Tuni Lal, established family workshops here, and their sons Shiv Lal and Shiv Dayal Lal emerged as leading artists. Shiv Lal developed a reputation for the delicacy of line and color and naturalism in his scenes of Indian life. Was also known as a portraitist. He further developed his family workshop, selling paintings on paper for 1 or 2 rupees and sets of 12 works on mica for 2 rupees 10 annas as recorded by the archers. His workshop employed at least 6 artists who started as apprentices, doing simple jobs and graduating to filling colors and eventually doing works. Of these, Gur Sahai Lal shows a more conservative approach with his native characters depicted with large eyes, curved lashes, heavy brows, and a strong feeling for geometric patterns. His color scheme remained limited to browns, greys, and occasional use of crimson or a mustard yellow. Banni Lal, on the other hand, was technically more sound and competent, and his color schemes are bright and fresh. Working both for commission and personal drawings, he produced ivory miniatures and works on paper. Another Patna painter, Shiv Dayal Lal, was also known as a portraitist on ivory and a painter of firqa sets. But as British patronage declined around 1870, he turned to Indian patrons, who too were keen to emulate the British and adopted their taste in pictures too. As a result, Shiv Dayal Lal was retained by Rai Sultan Bahadur. His workshop had two hereditary painters, Jamuna Prasad and Bahadur Lal II, and the fact that they were now painting for an Indian clientele is reflected in the return of a brighter color palette. Patna artists, while adapting to British tastes, seem to have employed certain elements without any real understanding of them, such as the use of perspective, which though did impose a geometric order on their work, and other British idioms used in a mechanical fashion. In fact, Patna painting, in its later phase, shows a reassertion of an earlier Indian palette with the use of brilliant colors such as scarlet or blue instead of the usual sepia tones and somber colors. But it was this prolific painting activity in the town that also gave company painting the moniker Patna painting. Banaras was ceded to the British in 1775, and within the next 4 decades, not only had it emerged as the commercial metropolis, but had eclipsed Murshidabad and Patna. This attracted the British, and a large, flourishing community grew up. The town of Banaras also excited the British for the picturesque views, and Indian artists also migrated to Banaras in search of work, moving here from Patna. One of the first artists whose presence is recorded here is Dallu Lal, and then a number of names emerge. Kamalpati, Shivaram, and Phulchand, who was Kamalpati's brother and shifted here from Jaipur. The sons and nephews of Kamalpati and Phulchand trained in the family workshop and practiced the art, some being Ganesh Prasad, Mahesh Prasad, Mistri Lal, and Munni Lal II. These artists were producing native characters, festivals, and some such as Dallu Lal were known as portraitists. The works were purchased not only by the British residents of the town, but largely also by those who travelled through on their journey up the country. Interestingly, in Banaras, the royal family adapted itself with alacrity to the changed circumstances and adjusted to the presence of the British by mixing with them and imbibing their habits. As a result, Raja Udit Narayan and his successor, Ishwari Narayan Singh, patronized artists such as Dallu Lal, Gopal Chand, and Lal Chand. The work for the Rajas was mainly portraits of the Raja, courtiers, servants and other friends and visitors, almost as keepers of record. By the end of the 19th century, Benares lost its earlier position as an important British station and led to a decline of the art of company painting here. Awadh was a significant province in the Mughal Empire, and under Shuja'ud-Dawla, it became virtually independent of the Mughal emperor. The opulence of the court attracted foreigners to Faizabad and then Lucknow. The court of Awadh had patronized a miniature painting style that, though derived from its parent Mughal style, had also evolved into a provincial Mughal style. During the reign of Shuja'ud-Dawla and Asaf-ud-Dawla, Indian artists working in the traditional style had been patronized by the rulers, as also the Europeans at court, such as Richard Johnson and Colonel John Bailey, as also Colonel Gentile, who became the French resident at Faizabad. But along with the presence of an active traditional style of painting, the Awadh rulers also began to patronize Western oil painters. The first was the British professional Tilly Kettle, who was invited to Faizabad during the reign of Shuja'ud-Dawla and here painted 6 large oil paintings showing the Nawab with his sons or the British resident and other officers, or the Nawab's individual portraits. The works became a source for the local painters to copy in order to imbibe this new aesthetic. In fact, Kettle's portraits of the Nawab became stock portrait images copied later by both Indian and European artists. This is seen in the copies by Mir Chand, who made many versions from it. The ingress of British culture increased during the reign of Asaf-ud-Dawla and became an estuarine tide under his successors, such as Saadat Ali and Ghazi-ud-Din Haidar. Under the latter, a number of British artists worked for the court, such as Robert Home, George Place, Thomas Longcroft, Charles Smith and George Beechey. The significance of Lucknow is that even though it never became a major center of company painting, it did impact the painting styles here, leading to at least 3 approaches. One dated by the artist from 1765 to 70, as seen in the work of the artists such as Nevasi, retained by Gentile, for whom he produced works that exhibit pale colors and are rendered in watercolors. Other examples are of this style, seen in this particular image. Second date from 1775 to 1800 and are the sets of native rulers and native characters done in pale watercolors in the company painting style. These works are types in which the faces are repeated. The third, dated from 1800 to 1830, is a style that, though in the Indian British or company painting style, exhibits a certain return of the palette of the original Lucknow manner, seen in the use of glowing greens, bright pinks and mauves, and brilliant reds and yellows. though these too are done in watercolors. This style is visible in the 50 Lucknow pictures in Oriental drawings and in the paintings in Customs of the Court of Oudh, to name two examples. Delhi had been a center of painting under the Mughals, and despite the decline in the fortunes of the Mughal dynasty, the Delhi artists, either for the emperor or more usually for the bazaar, continued to practice their traditional idiom or its variation. Apart from the paintings of the emperor in Darbar, outside the subjects painted were versions of Akbari Jahangiri period pictures, portraits of the Mughal emperors, depictions of women. The British, on their arrival in Delhi, sought the work the Delhi artists were already making. The other subject that attracted their attention was the picturesque landscape of the city. With its Sultanate and Mughal period monuments. Done in watercolors and paper, these incorporated pale, somber colors with the use of perspective in the rendering of the architecture. With time, the scale of the architecture reduced in the landscape and small figures in the foreground began to be included. Apart from this, through British encouragement, portraits on ivory began to be made. A number of artists are known to have worked for the British, such as Ghulam Murtaza Khan, who also worked for the Mughal court, thus adjusting his style for patrons with divergent preferences. Apart from him, Jeevan Ram is an artist who comes in for praise in the accounts of the British for the acute likeness in portraits. And according to Archers, the high praise seems to indicate his mastery of the British technique. In 1832, accompanying the suit of Lord William Bentinck to the Punjab, he drew Ranjit Singh, and later his portrait of the Maharaja was reproduced in Prinsep's book on the Sikhs. Ghulam Hussain Khan, Murtaza's son, also found patronage and praise from the British. In South India, the British had a major presence in the Madras region, and that led to the arrival of a number of British professional painters, such as Tilly Kettle, Zoffany, Smart, Kinnery, the Daniels, and others here. But Madras did not emerge as an important center of company painting, as the Indian artists were essentially employed as draftsmen by the army. It was beyond Madras that the company painting style flourished. Tanjore, which was the princely state, responded to this new stimulus. Early accounts speak of mochis, a term describing a group of artists as working for the local rulers, making paintings of the court and deities. Around 1775, the artist fraternity expanded with the arrival of artists from Hyderabad who infused in the tradition influences derived from the Deccani tradition of painting. According to scholars, the stage was set for the emergence of Tanjore painting. In the last 2 decades of the 18th century, the influence of the British in Tanjore increased greatly, and with the placing of Sirfaji on the throne in 1798, the adoption of British values was complete. His interest in Western art, the rudiments of which he had learned from a missionary in Tanjore, meant an enthused patronage of the manner. In fact, a book on natural history drawing is attributed to his patronage. Apart from this, one comes across sets of native characters, and later there appear portraits on ivory. Another style of painting that emerged at Tanjore was the images of deities on card or paper or wooden tablets or cloth. With the color mixed with a white earth and a rich bright color palette. This was further embellished with fragments of glass, stone or metal. Other places in the region that produced work for the British were Trichinopoly, Pudukkottai, Srirangam, Madura and the Malabar coast. In Western India, there do not appear any centres of art activity prior to the arrival of the British. The court of the Peshwa at Pune had employed British oil painters such as James Wales to primarily paint portraits, apart from which he also worked to superintend the Palace School of Drawing. Gangaram Tambat is recorded as one of his proficient students. But Bombay, Satara or Kutch do not show any evidence of the patronage of artists. Apart from Tambat, another name that comes from this region is of Din Ali, who painted the standard company painting subjects such as festivals and native characters. His style is seen in work he did for Thomas Broughton by illustrating the costume, character, manners, domestic habits, and religious ceremonies of Marathas. Letters written in a Maratha camp during the year 1809. In Punjab and particularly in Lahore, the local or court artists slowly became acquainted with British artworks through observing British amateurs like W.G. Osborne, Emily Eden, who visited the court, and also later professional painters such as the Austrian August Schoffet. An adjustment in style becomes visible in the work of a number of artists such as Imam Baksh, Keher Singh and Kishan Singh. Imam Baksh's work for the French generals in the Sikh army, such as Court and Avitabu, shows the use of transparent washes of watercolors and works based on observation. Keher Singh, who is mentioned as a court artist in the chronicles of the court of Ranjit Singh, worked as a muralist and a miniaturist, initially at Lahore and then Kapurthala. His lightly tinted sketches on paper depict native characters from ascetics to potters and members of castes and tribes. These works, though in the nature of company painting, are not simply representations of types. Inscriptions on the sketches in Urdu and Gurmukhi note details of the figures from their names to age to native town to their profession, among other things. The faces are sensitively studied and there is an empathy with the subject. Though we also come across the standard stock of firqa sets in bold colors and lines that were in all probability cheaply available in the bazaar. The quality of all these works depended primarily on the knowledge and taste of the patron and how much they could pay. Overall, company paintings provide a record of the social and cultural scene. Pran Neville believes that they cannot be seen as a decline of the classical art, but rather as a different style, which retained the elegance, poetic vision, and sensibility central to traditional Indian painting. Archers sum up company painting as marking a decline in the artistic traditions of the country, especially in comparison to the earlier Mughal and later Mughal painting. Though the change of medium to watercolor and democratic subjects are seen as clear precursors of later Indian attitudes that came to be reflected in modern Indian painting. In fact, Mildred Archer also states that company painting can be seen as the last original contribution by Indian artists before the modern deluge. By 1890, Indian painting for the British had virtually come to a close.